John, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much it means to have this space, not only to read from and talk about the book, but mostly to talk with Jamie. Sometimes my life as a writer is full of things that just feel kind of magical to me, and the fact that Jamie is somehow not only a writer that I adore and admire, but also my friend, is one of the most magical things. So it's such a pleasure to be here with her tonight. I'm going to read a brief essay from midway through the collection, which is called Public Anatomy. And Jamie and I will have a conversation, so I don't think I'll say too much in advance of it. Public Anatomy. We return to some spaces in the world because we enter them and feel that they were made for us. Others we come back to because we wish that they were, and still others pull us back despite our resistance, despite the grief they cause us. Like there's some filament, fine and strong as fishing line, stretched from a hook in our cheek all the way to that ground. For me, the anatomical theater in Bologna's first medical school is each of these spaces at once. This is the room where the earliest formal human anatomy classes were conducted, where doctors did some of the first scientific dissections of human bodies in the West. I'm here 16 months to the day after the first time I saw it. I am looking again at the marble dissection table, at the two skinless men whittled from wood to sinew up on the wall, at the figures representing 14 constellations carved into the ceiling. Bodies which look now in a way I don't remember from before, like they are caught in a perpetual fall. The rest of the city is profoundly unfamiliar. The streets, the language, the customs, and the light. I'm here alone on a writing fellowship with no built-in structure, and I often go whole days without speaking to anyone. Rolling my wheelchair along Bologna's smoothest porticos and turning left or right wherever there's a sudden set of stairs or the tile gives way to unnavigable cobblestones, letting my body's limits and the city's architecture dictate my path. I eat very little, both because the combined barriers of language and the high stone ledges into most of the cafes and restaurants frequently feel incapacitating, and because my appetite has all but evaporated. Instead, I make slow wheeling circles through the city's center until I find a place with outdoor tables where I can order an espresso or a drink and graze on the peanuts or chalky Italian crackers that come along with it. Or I sit and pick at small bowls of pasta at street-side tables. I read novels until the sun starts to set or scan the news from the States, which is never good. In the dark, I go back to the apartment that I'm renting, keep my eyes on the street, watching for abrupt changes in terrain. This becomes routine astonishingly quickly, the whole world narrowed to this little maze. It's only as it gets colder and the sun starts setting earlier and earlier that I zip my jacket up to my chin, shivering at a metal cafe table, and realize soon it will be a problem that I found almost nowhere I can get inside alone and eat a meal. Every space in the city has had so many lives. A few blocks from my apartment, there's a shell pink group of buildings that are now part of a university, but which in the centuries and centuries they've stood have been municipal offices, a monastery, a funerary space, and a prison. Now there are books lofted in the high barred windows that used to belong to jail cells, and undergrads in inexplicable silkscreen t-shirts which read things like "go, go, go" above a picture of a frog, studying where monks once prayed and bodies once lay, waiting for burial. The whole city is this spectacular kind of palimpsest, all its past selves visible under the transparent film of its present. And so is also a doubled memento mori. Every building is lit up with centuries of proof that it will outlast us all, and also with its narrow halls and doors, its windy stairs and lofted rooms, with the reminder that it comes from a time when a body like mine would never have survived, an era when my whole life would have been just an instant of impossibility. And so every day that I wake up here, I go out into these great and dueling benedictions and admonitions. Be grateful, you are small and brief and breathing. Be careful, you are small and brief and breathing. I keep a mental catalog of all the buildings it looks like I could enter without pain or trouble. Shop selling cheap plastic cell phone cases covered in fish, rhinestones, and flowers. Men's tailor. What must be a pawn shop with a strange constellation of old boom boxes, jewelry, and sports equipment in the front window. A bridal boutique. Quickly, I learned that my best bet is major chains. McDonald's, the Apple Store, the perpetual neon of the H&M. It's strange to see these corporations transplanted into this ancient city, taking over milky marble rooms with industrial fryers and faux leather leggings. But it's even stranger to reckon with the ways they make me realize capitalism is really the only force that's carved any kind of place for my body in this extraordinary city. Some corporate policy that reads, in summary, we build ramps in all our stores so that no matter what, you can come in and spend your money. Most of the churches in the city don't have obvious ramps unless they're also tourist attractions. But the automatic doors of the boutique Best Western have been retrofitted so that they're exactly flush with the street. I understand these corporations' motives. I'm frequently disgusted by their politics. I would resent their intrusion into any landscape I loved. They're the part of the city I want least, charmless places vacated of layered meaning. But when I discover that the Apple Store has a bathroom with elevator access big enough that I can use it in the wheelchair, I cry a little at the sink before I leave it. I've been limiting the amount of water I allow myself to drink during the day because I'm afraid of ending up desperate to pee with nowhere to go. The first time I watch a woman cross herself in the street when I approach, I think I must have misconstrued the situation, missed some unfamiliar cultural cue. I move past her and try to forget it. But the second time, the old man looks right at me as he makes the gesture, shuffles back away from me into the street, his face so devastated that I have a brief, fierce urge to comfort him. But then he turns away and I'm left enraged. At first, I'm sure he's mourning something ruined in the combination of my youth, my disability, and my femininity. Some wrecked potential for beauty, vitality, fertility, whatever. Then I think he's warding off whatever horrible accident he assumes befell me, like I'm a vampire spreading the contagion of misfortune. Hardly sleeping, ill at ease, and entirely solitary, I do feel, to be honest, a little vampiric. Only later do I wonder whether he caught me staring up and through the doors along the street that we were moving down. The perfumery, the little bookstore hung with ornate maps, the bakery, the narrow shop with a gray dress in the window, so beautiful, I just want to hold it. I had been peering into every one, wishing that I could go inside, trying not to pause too long at any single place. I wonder if what actually moved him to the gesture was the largeness and clarity of my desire, the transparency of my grief. I have spent the last month almost swallowed by the force of my desire, not just for entrance into the many pieces of the city that deny me access, but for another body entirely. I blame the one I have for the obvious things. The places I can't go, the amount of pain I'm in, the fact that I don't have the energy or wherewithal to start Italian lessons, to figure out how to take a bus to the Modern Art Museum, or even to stumble through a clumsy conversation with a friendly bartender. The energy to make a life for myself here. But I blame it for other things too. I blame it for making me feel selfish all the time because my attention is turned so thoroughly inward, attending to its needs. I blame it for my fear that my writing will always be narrow, hemmed in by its hurt and relentlessness. I blame it for screwing with my plans, for demanding revision to fit its stringent reality. I blame it for the fact that I'm alone here, though I chose it. I watch a young mother in a yellow scarf muscle her baby in a stroller up a sidewalk curb, and I blame my body. I watch a man leap up to restrain his old dog as a bicycle passes, and I blame my body. I watch a woman hold a door open with her hip while she sips a coffee, and I blame my body for all these flashes of lives that will never be mine. Above all, though, I blame my body for the fact that after all these years, I'm still grieving a plain, stupid grief that I can't hide. I blame it for being itself, for existing to be ruined and repaired. The anatomical theater is not a cathedral, but like a church, it is a place where men once pushed against the contours of the known, past what was immediately visible, towards something more magnificent, mysterious, and powerful. It is a place where they asked, what makes us who we are? Now it's a museum of the things we know and don't know about the body, a fraught and complicated monument to how we learned them, what we call error, and how we reach in to alter, inscribe, and repair it. To what's gained and lost in the remaking and all the violence and tenderness done in the name of that project now and for centuries before. It's a place the man first learned things that would save and shape me, that would let me walk, that would fail to let me walk well, that would yield both my range of motion and my scars. That would mean I could travel to this country alone, that I could enter a pawn shop, but not so many ancient churches. It's here they began to make a knowable place of my body by naming its parts. This room is the reason I don't remember myself before a man opened me up and altered my wiring. My first memory is a surgical theater. This is as close to the beginning as I can go, just to learn that I can't stay. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Molly. And hey, everybody. Welcome to a corner of my bedroom, reappropriated as an office. I have 3 college kids quarantining with my husband and myself, so it's been an interesting, time. Molly, I just have to say, it has been such a pleasure to reread this book the past couple of days. This essay collection made me cry the first time I read it, and it made me cry the second time I read it. It's beautiful, and I'm so excited to be here for your launch and to celebrate with you. Molly and I cracked a bottle of I don't know, was yours Prosecco? Mine was Prosecco.
It was, I think they were identical bottles.
I mean, we had to be Italian, right? It's all about Italy. Yeah. So yeah, we cracked bottles of Prosecco together and raised a glass. So toast to you. I mean, this is her launch. So I guess I want to start out by asking you maybe to share, I mean, maybe there's people here who don't know the basics of your biography and your disability. So maybe sharing a little bit of that, and then kind of talking about how the essay collection came to be. And as of last Tuesday? Blackout Tuesday, that was your launch? Your actual launch?
Tuesday, yeah.
Oh gosh. Yeah, that's have been a weird experience to have a book coming out. No. Yeah. So take it away.
Yeah, so the kind of major facts to know are that I have a neurological disorder called cerebral palsy, and the easiest way to explain it is that it's a little bit like a stroke that happens in utero or immediately after birth. And for lots of people, it's the result of oxygen deprivation as the result of being premature, and that was the case for me. I was born at about 27 weeks, and I had an identical twin who died about 36 hours after we were born. And I grew up in a household with writer parents. My parents are novelists, and that has never sort of felt more relevant in my adult life than it feels right now, because I am quarantining in their house. They're on the other side of the door, not listening to this conversation so that my internet doesn't freeze, which is kind of them.
So they can't be here with you right now watching?
Yeah, it's a great loving sacrifice that they're performing to not be listening into this, so that I can be talking to all of you.
Wow.
Yeah, and so those are the kind of broad strokes of my biography. And as you could maybe tell from John's bio, I am or have been primarily a poet. And you asked how this book came to be, and really the answer is that it came to be because I have a wonderful editor, Gabriel Fried, who published my first poetry collection, who discovered at some point, I think before that book was even out, that I wrote essays, and read a few online, and wrote to me and said, you know, you've thought about writing a book of nonfiction, right? And I knew sort of just enough at that point to know that if someone says, do you have a book proposal idea, you don't, you lie. And you say, yes, I have definitely thought about this. I absolutely have an idea. And so I did. I lied, and then I had to go to the drawing board and kind of figure it out.
Wow.
But the truth is that I really started writing nonfiction, I think because I have always been a person, and, as I said, I was a person raised by writers. I was a reader. I was always a person who sort of looked for their company and community and understanding in literature. And as I kind of came of age, as a woman with a disability, and I was starting to kind of grapple with the fact that, this was going to be the body in which I had to live not only my kind of childhood full of medical intervention, but the whole rest of my existence. I went looking for company and understanding what that looked like, and it was hard to find literarily. There were lots of cure narratives. There were sort of limited stories about illness, but I wasn't finding a lot. And really, I think that these essays that eventually became this book really arose out of a desire to keep myself company, and to produce a thing I wasn't finding.
Wow. Well, I mean, you and I were talking earlier about how, like, so many narratives that deal with the body, or like with a differently abled or disabled, or in some way a body that doesn't fit the scripted narratives that we've, constructed as society, that those books tend to be like either cure narratives, or like, I didn't find a cure, but I've like come to accept like who I am, and like, fuck the world, this is me. And that like, we're really uncomfortable with the gray middle space of like, yes, my body is difficult, and yes, I love it, and yes, like all of these things are true all at once. And I love how your book kind of speaks into that, especially I feel right now. I mean, obviously, we all know we're like living in this era where pre-COVID, at least for me, mobility and health were like the rule, and stasis and illness and disability were like the exception. And now I'm recognizing all of us are coming to terms with like the fragility, the privilege of movement, the privilege of health, and sort of the ableist thinking that's embedded in just in the way our culture functions. And I feel like your book right now places I've taken my body. I mean, we're all thinking about like, where do I take my body right now? Where do I not take my body? And even John earlier, we were talking, and he was saying like he's going back to New York, and the complexities of that. So for me, I'm like, this is the book that everybody should be reading at this exact moment. And yet we're like in this era of like hijacked reading because of the news cycle and all that. So can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to have this incredibly important book coming into the world at a time when it was like Black Eyed Tuesday and you couldn't even post about it or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, this is a strange moment, right, at which to be putting out art. And it's a strange moment, it's a strange moment because we're sort of all in the midst of a global emergency in terms of the pandemic. It's a strange moment because the sort of the public health landscape feels so fraught, and it's also a strange moment because I think we're having and it's hard to say because I want to say like yet another, right? We're having like yet another and incredibly overdue and urgent reckoning with the like racist and white supremacist structures that underpin this country, right? And with the real problem of police brutality and police violence. And that is a conversation that is urgent and necessary, and that I feel like we have to keep having, and we have to keep having in the face of truly mortal tragedy. And so on the one hand, it's like, okay, fine, like no one needs to be thinking about my book right now, because the truth is, whatever ways my body is marginalized and at risk and fragile, there are also these really true and really profound ways in which, as a white person, I benefit from a system that that devalues and puts at really mortal risk other bodies and other lives on the basis of race. And so on the one hand, I feel like, you know what, like I can deal with whatever small personal grief comes from this not being the moment to like be super excited about the fact that I put out a book, because we're having this other really important conversation. And all I hope is that this book, which is really interested in the kind of complicated project of what it means to be a person in a body in the world, sticks around and is eventually a part of a nuanced conversation about that project, which is, as you've pointed out, I think we're all especially encountering in this moment, inescapable for all of us, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We are all in inherently mortal, inherently fragile, and deeply inescapable bodies.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought up the protests and the murders of obviously George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And oh my gosh, there's a big storm here. Just in case you hear a loud crash. There's like
let's all hope the power stays on.
Yes, please. Will the power to stay. But your book talks a lot about anger and rage, and I think it's such an important thing because we've tended to like demonize those emotions and say like, well, those are negative things, you know, don't stay in those places. But there is a moment when rage and anger and the like tight-fisted desire to like burn things is righteous and right. And I feel like we are at that moment in our country's history and in the world's history. And your book speaks directly to that.
Yeah, I mean, I am someone for whom anger has been, you know, in some ways like an incredibly necessary and an incredibly productive emotion. And, you know, and I talk some in the book about how sometimes anger and frustration and rage has been the thing that literally allows me to get out of bed in the morning in the face of chronic pain, in the face of depression, in the face of feeling alienated by the particular physical and lived circumstances in my life. Sometimes if you're mad, you feel like, okay, I'm angry, and that's going to be the thing that allows me to get out of bed. And I do believe, and I believe particularly acutely in this moment, in the power of anger to be an engine toward something, right? And in the power of the destruction and the energy that is necessarily behind anger to be a really vital force. You know, I think the complicated thing is anger is an easy emotion to, you know, you're driving and you think you're driving it, and then all of a sudden it takes over and it's the thing that's driving, and all of a sudden you're not burning down the thing you meant to burn down. You're not, you know, you're burning down.
Right.
It's a forest fire, right? It's the difference between, okay, I lit that thing on fire because it needed to be lit on fire, and like, oh no, I no longer can control this anymore. And I think that the book is really interested in the kind of complicated hinge point between those two things, and in what it means to try to be a person who feels a really inescapable and really righteous kind of anger, and wants to figure out, how do I utilize that in my own life, and how do I utilize it for my own benefit and for other people's benefit, and also how do I not let it become the only thing that is in the room, and let it become the thing that's damaging things I actually want to protect and uphold, and relationships and communities that really matter to me.
Right. That really spoke to me, that tension between, like, I guess, initiatory anger. I think I heard of Tara Brach. Have you ever heard of Tara Brach? She's like this kind of meditation. I love her. She said something like, anger is initiatory, but it's never transformative. So that, like, anger is that thing, right, that gets us in motion and moving, but it, like, how long do we stay there, and then at what point does it become a forest fire? So yeah, I loved that about your book. Should we talk about faith?
Yeah, anytime. Yeah.
Okay. So when Molly and I first met in person, we were in Little Rock. The great Eliza Bournay, editor of Oxford American, who I believe is in the room with us this evening.
She's the greatest. We love you, Eliza.
We love you, Eliza. And then Molly and I, we met in the offices, and later that, I think we went out for sushi, and we talked. It was 5 hours and felt like 5 minutes or something. But one of the biggest topics of our conversation, I think, was your conversion to Catholicism and my interest in Catholicism. I was raised Protestant and very attracted to ritual and all that. So you converted in your early 20s, and in large part as a sort of this mystical sense of your sister's presence. Is that right? Your twin sister?
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, I grew up in a part of the world where the kind of dominant religious force is fundamentalist Southern baptism, and I write a little bit about that in the book. And I grew up, you know, in a household that you know, my parents weren't especially religious, and really I understood religion is as being twinned with this kind of, not only with a sort of really intense kind of cultural conservatism, but with, you know, a real kind of a bigotry and prejudice and a sort of rabidly anti-intellectual attitude. And I think for a long time, because of that, I was really resistant to the notion that I believed in anything divine, or and certainly that I you know was going to sort of say like, yes, okay, this particular faith tradition or this organized religion feels resonant enough to me that I'm going to declare some kind of meaningful affinity with it. But you know, the other thing is that I did, as I mentioned to y'all earlier, like I do have a twin sister who died when we were infants, and her presence and absence, and the sense that I miss this person who technically I never knew, and that also in some way she feels sort of omnipresent to me, has really been true my whole life, and it's underpinned my consciousness for kind of as long as I can remember. And the thing about that is that I felt like, okay, in the face of that, like you have to believe in something, right? Like there's no other choice, because what is the explanation otherwise? For this thing? And I think, you know, and I think I came, you know, and I will say, you know, I still have a you know, a sort of a relationship to Catholicism, particularly as it often plays out in the country today, that feels troubled and fraught and difficult. But it also feels, you know, Catholicism is a faith that is so entwined not only with ritual, but with the kind of importance of the physical body and the inescapability of the physical body. And as difficult as that was, it felt incredibly meaningful to me. And then it's also just true, as I write, and as you and I have talked about, that when I go to mass and participate in that experience, I feel transformed and transported by that experience. And it's the one thing in my life, you know, I'm an academic, I'm a teacher. What I do for a living is explain things, you know, to other people, and logic my way through them. And it's the one thing in my life that I can't actually logic my way through or into or out of. And it's also incredibly important to me, you know.
Yeah, I loved the tension that you drew between like saying, so when I go to mass, like in a very real sense, I can't genuflect the way that other people can. I can't stand, I can't kneel in these ways that, so in one sense, the ritual or the, you know, the liturgy of Catholicism is limiting, but then it also, your Catholicism asks you to confront the disabled, suffering, bent body as intentional, as something like designed or like a divine plan to it. And you quote your father, Joe, what if we all have the bodies we're meant to have? What does it mean if my body is not a punishment or a mistake? And so that Catholicism and your practicing of Catholicism is asking you to sort of live with this duality of it's excluding me and it's also asking me to see my body in this like incredibly profound way. And I love the way too in the book you talk about the body as a geography, and you have these like two geographies operating side by side. So you have you know, your own body, which is like almost a map that you have to relearn over and over again, right? Because you could walk when you were young, and then you lost that ability at adolescence. And then as you got older, the pain would increase. So it's like you're constantly relearning the interior geographies. And then you have this like very real, large geography of the world that you're constantly traveling. And maybe we haven't talked about this yet, that the oxygen, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but the oxygen deprivation that you experienced at birth, like injured the neural pathways that control spatial cognition. Is that right?
Yeah.
So you actually quite literally can't form a map in your head.
Yeah. So like one of the strange consequences, you know, there are some, in addition to the kind of very visible orthopedic consequences of cerebral palsy, there's some neurological damage. The result of which is that I never have any idea where I am, because I can't form sort of abstract spaces or patterns in my brain, and it's partly due to that damage, and it's also partly due to the fact that, and this is, you know, there are real scientists in the room who understand the nuanced explanation for this. Then I'm sorry for the way that I'm about to give a very ham-fisted one, but sort of what we understand about neurological development is also that. Part of the way that infants and young children learn to sort of map their way through the world and learn a sense of direction is through sort of like moving independently through the world, right? As babies learn to walk and to crawl and to sort of control their own physical motion through the world, they learn to map it. They learn to get a sense of it. And you know, the other result of my cerebral palsy is that I didn't learn to walk or even to crawl until very late. And it's really too late for that kind of spatial intelligence to have developed in the way that it should have. And so there are kind of there's a sort of whole layered multiple set of reasons why I never have any idea where I am in the world. And also because the reality of my body is so ever changing, both because, you know, my level of mobility, my level of pain has changed as I've gotten older, and because I live in a body that has been, has had a lot of surgical intervention happen to it, in various kinds of ways and at various kinds of times. My sense of the geography of the world is never stable and never certain, and also my sense of the geography of my body is never stable.
Right, and then you're out like going to like all of these foreign places constantly. It's just like it's kind of, in some ways it seems strange that would be the choice you'd make, but in other ways it makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
as you write about.
Right. I mean, like, pragmatically, it is the worst idea, right? It's like, okay, if you are a person who like doesn't ever have any idea where you are and has trouble moving through unfamiliar spaces and is likely to encounter all kinds of like practical obstacles to her access to things in the world, like maybe you should be a person who like buys a house in one place and then stays there in the land that she has learned to navigate. And instead, I have spent my whole adult life traveling and sort of changing locations every 12 to, you know, like 30 months, really for more than a decade now. And I think, you know, I talk a little bit in the book that I think some of that is, I worry sometimes that it's become a kind of mechanism of defense, right? I think some of it is, it's absolutely like, I'm curious, I'm interested, the world's a remarkable place, like I want to see as much of it as is possible. But I also think that there is this idea that like, if I am always either leaving or entering a place, if I'm always new somewhere, if it's always temporary, there's a kind of explanation for my dislocation inside it and my alienation inside of it that I can blame on or articulate as being about something external to me rather than some intrinsic flaw or truth about who I am, right? If you move every second, you're not a stranger because something is wrong with you. You're a stranger and you're alienated and lost in the world because you're new. Everyone's a stranger and new.
I love how you say it. It's such a quotable line. I needed to leave a place before it left me. I mean, it's like kind of a perfect like way of saying what you're saying. Before we open it up to questions, I feel like we need to talk about sex.
We're gonna talk about faith. I mean, we gotta talk about.
It's the great intersection, right? Yeah. I mean, desire is sort of the linchpin where desire for God and desire for sex. I mean, they meet. So we both do share the sense that the sexual and the sacred are like so intimately connected they can't be parsed. And you have this amazing essay, The Broken Country, on disability and desire. And in that essay, you write about these incredibly cruel and just unthinking comments that people, like complete strangers, will say to you and like come up and just say like, are you able to have sex or whatever? And one of the ones that really kind of broke my heart was, you were with a man and you were undressing, and I don't remember what the context was, but he was looking at you and you were like, he's gonna say something about my beauty or like, I want you or whatever, and he asked if he can trim your toenails. Right. And it was just this like hardcore moment of, oh my God, he's seeing me in such a different way than I'm seeing myself right now. So this idea that like there was always this distinct border between your own desire and your body as a country that could be desirable. You really probe that. And I just wanted to ask to talk a little bit about how your cerebral palsy and how it has affected your, navigation through the sexual terrain of your life.
Sure. I mean, I think that there are, it's always really interesting to think about questions like this or to think through them because it's, people often say, and it's a totally interesting and reasonable question, like, okay, what is the way in which your disability has like affected this part of your life, right? Or what, you know, how do you think that this is at play here? And, you know, and I have some answers to that question, to those questions. And another part of them is always, I actually can't tell you because I don't know what part of my relationship to intimacy is about who I am as a person, is about, you know, and I can't delineate necessarily, oh, like how would I struggle with questions of intimacy to quite the same degree if I weren't you know, a person with a disability, or would this feel complicated in quite the same way? But I think what I can tell you is a couple of things. One is that, you know, and I say this with, you know, all the gratitude in the world to modern medicine for the ways that it has intervened in my body and given me increased mobility and relief from pain and things like that to varying degrees. I'm very grateful for that intervention. But I also think that it really affects your self-conception. If you are a person who grows up hearing all the time, something is intrinsically wrong with you. Something about your body is intrinsically incorrect and wrong and unappealing and strange. And we're going to do a lot of intervening to correct that. And it's never going to happen we're never going to get all the way there, right? You're always going to be and so it's disconcerting to grow up, you know, and disconcerting is not even a strong enough word. It's complicated to grow up with that, in sort of internalizing that narrative about yourself prior to any other narrative. You know, the first thing I knew how to say about myself was that I had cerebral palsy and that I could tell you what it was, you know. And that is complicated. And I think it has certainly complicated the way in which I think about the desirability of my own body, its appeal, its space in the world. But I also think that the other piece of that is that my body has, as I detail, frequently been a space that has caused me a great deal of pain, right? And that has been dangerous and untrustworthy, and painful and difficult. And then it became so for me increasingly at a moment that was the kind of moment at which I also like hit adolescence, right? And became a person who was going through puberty and was having this you know, my kind of move into adulthood happened at exactly the same moment that the most radical sort of breakdown of my body happened. And that's complicated. And I think understanding also your body is this place that is the place of pain and a place of error. Your body is this place that is always going to need to be fixed somehow. And your body as a space that all the people who've sort of had the most intimate access to it have done so because they needed to either help it or correct it in some way. It makes complicated that reality. But I mean, the other thing is also to say that like my body is the body in which I live my whole life. And so, you know, it's also the space where intimacy has and does occur. It's the space, you know, that is in some ways, it's taught me a lot about how you jump rope the line between pleasure and pain, and how you sort of navigate your own relationship to physical sensation. And those are things that are particular to my experience as a disabled woman as well. They're as particular as any of the rest of it. And figuring out how those two things coexist, and how you see vulnerability in you know, in all spaces, but especially in sort of romantic and sexual spaces. In that way, I think it's everyone's ongoing project, right? And it's just
right.
my ongoing project in this way that is it's made particularly complicated.
Well, I loved that essay, and I so appreciated your I guess the ways that you drew everybody into that conversation. We could have so much more to talk about this particular topic, but I think we're ready to go to questions.
Yeah, we've got a few questions here. Erica asks, which essay in the collection was the most surprising for you to write?
That's a really interesting question. I think the answer is probably it's the final essay in the book, which is an essay called Frankenstein Abroad, which is an essay that is in part about my relationship to Mary Shelley's novel, partly about rereading that text in Europe while I was on this fellowship that I read a little bit about in public anatomy, and thinking about my relationship to that novel in as it relates to questions of alienation and loneliness and monstrosity and grief. You know, and I write in the essay that this is a novel that I first encountered as a college student, feeling very acutely sort of affected by what I felt then as the kind of monstrosity of my own body, the strangeness of the way that I moved, the omnipresence of pain, the ways in which I understood my body as a thing that alienated me from other people. And I think, and then that was a novel that it mattered to me. It was really complicated for me, and it continued to matter to me sort of throughout my adult life. And I think the thing that was maybe most surprising about writing that essay for me was that in writing it in Bologna and in rereading that novel, I reread the text, and for the first time I noticed a line of Victor Frankenstein, not the creature but his maker, in which he says essentially, how much happier a man who believes his hometown to be the world than one who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. And sort of at that moment in time, it was a moment in time in which I was feeling like, oh no, I have maybe put myself in a place that I can't manage, and I have taken on a project that is much greater than my nature will allow. And all of a sudden, my kind of affinity for where I was located in the novel changed and became more complicated. You know, I had always identified with the creature, and all of a sudden it was his creator who I sort of was feeling like, oh no, you're actually the person who I'm feeling most acutely for here. And it was just a moment, as in some ways this whole book was, where I re-encountered these texts that have meant a lot to me, and I was reminded of the thing which I always tell my students, but believed felt very acutely in that moment, which is that a text is new to you each time you come to it, right? You are always a different person each time you come back to the text, and that was strange and a pleasure. And that essay is one of the longest ones in the book, and I miserably avoided writing it for weeks and months before it finally came out, and the book wouldn't be the same without it now.
What kind of creative writing do you teach? Poetry or nonfiction, or?
So I teach a mix of things. So sometimes I teach poetry, sometimes I teach multi-genre classes that are our students encountering all kinds of genres for the first time. Sometimes I teach nonfiction. It just depends on what institution needs at any given time.
And as a writer, which form feels more natural to you? I know Jamie's former teacher, Amy Hempel, is always quoting poets, referencing poets, and I think somebody asked her once why she doesn't just write poetry herself, and her answer was something to the effect of, she's like, I understand sentences, I don't understand the poetic line. And she's like, and I couldn't do it. Which form do you feel most at home in?
So I've been a poet since I was a small child. It was the only thing that I sort of ever wanted to do. And my parents, both of whom are novelists, like to joke that that's my small rebellion. That they are fiction writers, and so I therefore had to be a poet. But the truth is that it always felt like my first language, and that there was something in the music of it, in the compression of it, in the strangeness of it, in the way that a poem is always sort of inherently both a fragment and a whole, that just felt really intrinsically true to me. And I think, poetry still feels like my first language, and I think always will. But I became really fond of the essay form as I was working on it, and the sort of the space that it allows for walking around.
Kristen asks, what is the hardest question your students have asked you?
So I should say that if this is the person who I believe it is, that this person is my colleague. So this is a funny question. God, what is the hardest question my students have asked me? I don't know that there's a single question that I can land on I think the thing that I'm sort of most frequently having to disabuse my incredibly talented, incredibly hardworking students right now at Kenyon College of is that they really like to do things correctly, right? They want to do things. They want to do things right. They want to achieve at high levels. They want to get the right answer to things, and that I appreciate that as an achievement-oriented person. I also feel that way. And they will often ask questions about literature or about the creation of their own work, which essentially amount to, what's the right answer to this, right? Or like, what's the and so often in art there is no right answer, right? And the right answer is in fact like there's not a solution to this problem, right? There's not a way to do this correctly. There's just the process of discovery, right? And in fact, the process of discovery is the only right answer. And I feel like in some ways, if I can give them one thing, I hope it's the notion that sort of taking a risk and being willing to walk toward and through something without the notion of where you're going to end up on the other side, or without the assurance that you're going to be able to do it completely correctly, is a thing I think we all probably would benefit from being a little better at doing.
Susanna asks, how does being a poet train your attention as an essayist? This seems like an essential part of your work.
Thanks, Suze. And this is another thing to say, is that Susanna is one of my dearest friends, and she's also my co-author. That book that you talked about, In the Field Between Us, is a collection of poems that we wrote together, and she asks this question from a place of having been a person who talked with me a lot about this and who read a lot of these essays as they were in progress. And I think the for me, the thing that poetry has given me is a kind of real appreciation for the kind of transformation that can happen in the face of stillness and slowness, and of sustaining your attention on one particular thing, your body in one particular place. And so for me, the thing that being a poet brings to my work as an essayist is this notion that there's truth and complexity not only in the thing that you are writing about with language, but in the language that you use to write about that thing, right? And so a sentence always has two realities inside of it, right? It has whatever the reality of its subject is, and then it has whatever the material reality of its language is. And the writing I love most across genres is writing that is always cognizant of both of those realities at the same time, and of the kind of remarkable way that they can harmonize together. And I think that's a thing that being a poet really trained me to do. And thanks for that question, Suze.
Ravi says, congrats, Molly. Can you talk about the move from the poems in the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded to the essays, which seem more transparently personal and yet still infused with lyric movement? Are there elements from the earlier work that made their way into the new book? There is an essay of the same name in the book.
Yeah, I mean, so there is so the Virginia State Colony, really super briefly, is a collection of poems about a real historical government-run hospital in the early and mid-1900s that was one of the major hubs of the American Eugenics, where thousands of people who either had or were perceived to have a variety of disabilities were forcibly committed and forcibly sterilized there. Not only often without their consent, but largely without their knowledge. They were told that they were being given appendectomies and were sterilized instead. And that book takes place largely in the voices of imagined patients and staff in the colony at the height of the sterilization movement in the 1930s. And so it's a book that took, in some ways, it's technically a much less personal book, right? And that almost none of the poems in the text occur in my own voice. It took a lot of research to do. And I was telling Jamie that, in the very beginning, I was very resistant to the idea that I was writing a memoir when I was working on this book, and I think it had largely to do with the notion that my life wasn't particularly interesting, and that maybe you shouldn't write a memoir before you turn 30 unless something really extraordinary has happened to you. And so in some ways, you know, the move that for me was the hardest move to make was one where I was just sort of, you know, I couldn't be like, oh, I'm just going to research this thing and think about this thing for a really long period of time and then have something to say about it. I have to tell you about my own lived experience, and I have to do it with no veils in a certain kind of way. And Susanna can tell you from reading many versions of this collection that, you know, she at a certain point, I would get to various places in the essays and I would go on like long tangents about like, here's the history of a lot of various kinds of animals. And she would be like, that's not, you have to take that out of the essay. That's you avoiding talking about the thing that is most vulnerable. No one needs to know about leopards for like 6 paragraphs. We should probably cut that. And so in some ways the move, I think it was partly a move that was about, thinking about many of the things that I've thought about in the colony through a sort of much more acutely personal lens. But I think that again, the sort of sustained attention that project had required, and the sustained attention to a particular time and place in the world was a sustained attention that I could actually turn on myself. And it wasn't always super comfortable to do so, but it was possible. You know, and then the other move is the move from poetry to prose. And for me, the sort of largest change there was just, it's so many words. Like, this is not a long book. And I still felt by the end of it, like I could not really fathom the number of words that I had produced, because as a poet, you labor like 3 days over 2 lines and you feel like, oh, I've done it ridiculously, you know, and somehow I was supposed to produce 60,000 words. Like, what does that look like, you know?
And I think we have time for just one more, but it's a good one. And it's from Leslie Jameson. She says, Molly, I loved your reading and your conversation with Jamie and your essay, The Broken Country, in VQR about desire, where I first encountered your work, and which ends in the kind of beautiful simultaneity you and Jamie were talking about earlier, allowing pain to live beside grace rather than falling into the easy resolution of acceptance. I wonder if when you write essays, you find yourself having to actively refuse overly neat epiphanies or resolutions. Do you find yourself reaching for them and then willfully complicating them? Or is the task more often to identify and label all the conflicting truths and feelings? And I was rereading the book last night. There are a couple moments in the collection where you will express a feeling or a thought and almost catch yourself and say, you know, that's melodrama, and I don't want to write melodrama. Are there any other cases in the book where, or in your writing life, where you catch yourself having to avoid something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have such a human impulse for closure, for concision, for, as Jamie and I were talking about, for cure, or for the notion of, you know, like when are you going to sort of have worked your way entirely through something, and come to some understanding about it. I mean, I've been noting it even in the way that we talk about this pandemic. You know, we want to know, like, when are we going to come to the other side of it? When are things going to go back to normal? When are we going to have reached some point where we've moved through this? And I think it's such a human impulse. And I certainly, you know, am a person with a big impulse for epiphany and a big impulse for, you know, for the idea of like, I've figured something out here. But I think in one way, the thing I love about the essay form is because it is a form that provides so much opportunity, and in some ways necessity, to evidence thinking on the page and to evidence the kind of evolution of ideas. It's a form that resists that inherently, right? Because you've already sort of necessarily charted out the messy and complex pathways by which we've arrived at a certain place. And so I love that. And I also, you know, one gift of this book, even as it was really difficult, is that because of the book that it became and because of the way that I was working on it, it became, as I was writing it, a book in which I often sort of wrote my way up to the like very immediate present tense, right? Like I wrote my way up to literally the moment in which I was producing the essay. And so I couldn't pretend to have something definitive to say about the future or something wise to say about that moment, or something that was where I could, you know, sort of zoom out and all of a sudden, you know, make the Alice Munro move where I was like 20 years later, she thought, because there is no 20 years later. There's just that moment in time. And so the book necessarily has to make an enormous amount of space for for uncertainty and for the absence of an easy conclusion, because it's almost always writing its way up to the present tense of a life that is not only still ongoing, but also still very young, right? Like, I'm a person who like knows to some degree a lot about my own experience and also knows almost nothing. And the book is, I think, simultaneously aware of those realities. And I hope that saved the essays from too many easy conclusions.
It did. They did. Well, Molly, Jamie, and everybody who joined us tonight, thank you so much. This is a dream. Buy your copy of Molly's book from us. This is my galley. I'm getting my finished copy when I get to New York on Thursday. Buy Jamie's books from us. Take a look at our events calendar and see who else is coming. But this was just, I'm so glad we were able to do this. I'm so happy to launch this book into the world. Congratulations on publishing it. And just thank you, the two of you, and everybody for joining us. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you, Jamie, for doing this with me.
Be well, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again.
Bye, y'all.